Chapter 1. A Body Among the Shelves. Lady Bantry had never much cared for books, but she cared a great deal for the appearance of caring for them, and so it was that Pemberton's rare books had become, over the course of a single spring, the most fashionable shop in St. Mary Mead. She said as much to Miss Marple, on the morning the two of them walked down from the vicarage after service, their gloved hands tucked against the April chill. "A bookshop gives a village a certain tone, Jane. Colonel Bantry disagrees, of course. He says a man cannot get a decent thriller in the place, only dusty things about Roman roads. But I think it does us credit." Miss Marple, whose pale blue eyes missed remarkably little for a woman so occupied with her knitting, murmured her agreement and privately thought that Mr. Pemberton's shop smelled less of paper than of something faintly bitter, like old pennies left too long in a damp pocket. She had noticed the smell on her last visit and had said nothing, because there is rarely anything useful to be gained by remarking on a smell before one has a reason for the remark. The bell above the shop door did not ring when Lady Bantry pushed it open. That was the first wrongness, though neither woman marked it as such at the time. "Mr. Pemberton," Lady Bantry called, in the bright carrying voice she used for tradesmen and for people she suspected of not listening properly. No answer came. The shop lay in its usual half-gloom, the blinds drawn low against the sun that faded old bindings, and dust moved in the single shaft of light that escaped through the gap where the curtain did not quite meet the sill. It was Miss Marple who saw the feet first. They protruded from behind the tall case of county histories at the rear of the shop, toes pointed upward in a manner that struck her at once as wrong, though she could not yet have said why. She crossed the floor with a quickness that surprised Lady Bantry, who had grown used to thinking of her old friend as slow and given to reminiscence. Josiah Pemberton lay on his back between the ladder and the case, his spectacles some distance from his outstretched hand, his neck bent at an angle that no sleeping man's neck ever achieved. His skin had the grey, waxen look Miss Marple had seen twice before in her long life, and both times it had meant the same thing. Lady Bantry made a small sound, not quite a scream, and pressed her handkerchief to her mouth. "Jane, Jane, is he?" "I am afraid so, Dolly. You had better fetch Constable Palk. I will stay." Left alone, Miss Marple did not touch the body, for she had learned that lesson from Colonel Melchett many years before. She stood instead with her hands folded and looked, in the manner that had become second nature to her, at everything around the dead man, rather than at the man himself. The library ladder stood at an angle some 3 feet from where it ought to rest if he had truly fallen from its top rung. A single volume, bound in green cloth, lay open on the floor near his shoulder, its pages fanned as though it had been dropped rather than let fall in the ordinary way of a man losing his balance. And the spectacles. Miss Marple returned to them twice. A man who topples from a ladder does not, as a rule, lose his spectacles 4 feet from his outstretched hand, and land them so neatly, lens up, upon the floorboards, as though someone had set them down with care. She noted, too, a faint discoloration at the tips of his fingers, a green so pale it might have been shadow, had shadow ever possessed that particular chalky quality. She thought of her own gardener's hands after a morning spent with the copper sulphate spray for the roses, and something in her mind, quiet and patient as a spider building in a corner no one sweeps, began to make a small and careful note. Constable Palk arrived within 10 minutes, breathless and self-important, and pronounced the matter a plain accident before he had properly examined the ladder. Elderly gentleman, weak ankle, everyone in the village knew he'd take a tumble one day, standing on the top rung, reaching for them county histories nobody ever buys. He said this with the particular satisfaction of a man delivering a verdict that requires no further work of him, and Miss Marple, who had heard such satisfaction before, said nothing at all, because there is rarely anything useful to be gained by contradicting a policeman before one has a reason for the contradiction. Word travelled through St. Mary Mead, the way water finds the low places in a field, swiftly, and by paths no one troubles to plan. By afternoon, the greengrocer's boy had told the vicarage gardener, who had told the vicar's sister, who had told Mrs. Price Ridley over the fence, and by the time Miss Marple returned to her own cottage, the postmistress already knew, with complete and entirely mistaken confidence, that poor Mr. Pemberton had suffered a heart seizure while dusting the top shelf. Miss Marple sat that evening with her knitting untouched in her lap and thought about ladders and about spectacles that land too neatly and about a green stain the exact shade of a rose gardener's fingers in June. She thought, too, about the book that had lain open beside him and wondered, not for the first time in her life, whether a man's death might have been decided long before the ladder ever tipped, in some quieter room, over some quieter transaction, by someone who had smiled at him only that morning across the counter. Outside her window the vicarage bell tolled the hour, ordinary and unhurried, as though nothing in St. Mary Mead had changed at all. Miss Marple knew better. She had lived in villages long enough to understand that nothing ever truly changed in them, that the same small greeds and small fears simply wore new faces each generation, and that somewhere behind one of those familiar faces, a murderer was at this moment congratulating himself on a job well done. She picked up her knitting again, but her needles moved slowly, and her mind did not follow the wool at all. Chapter 2. The American Gentleman. The funeral was held on the Thursday, a grey, unremarkable day that suited the general mood of the village, which had already begun to lose interest in Mr. Pemberton's death, in favour of the more pressing question of who might take over the shop. St. Mary Mead did not like an empty premises on the high street. An empty premises invited speculation, and speculation unchecked had a way of curdling into anxiety about property values. Miss Marple attended, as she attended most funerals, not from any particular fondness for the deceased, but from a lifelong habit of watching who wept and who did not, who stood near the family and who hung back by the lych gate, as though reluctant to be seen arriving at all. It was in this manner that she first properly noticed Mr. Cyrus Vane. He was tall in the loose-jointed American fashion, with a good coat that had clearly cost a great deal, and a hat he removed rather too slowly, as if he were unused to the gesture and had practiced it before a mirror. He stood at the back of the small crowd, near the yew hedge, and his eyes moved over the mourners with an attentiveness that had nothing to do with grief. "An American," Lady Bantry whispered afterward, over sherry at Gossington Hall, in the tone she reserved for things simultaneously thrilling and faintly suspect. "Staying at the Blue Boar. He came into the shop twice last month, Mr. Pemberton told me, asking after some frightfully rare thing, a first edition of something or other. Pemberton wouldn't sell it to him, or so the story goes, and the American was not best pleased about it." "Did Mr. Pemberton say what the book was?" Miss Marple asked, her needles clicking with their usual patient rhythm. "I don't recall that he did, only that it was worth a very great deal of money, and that he, Pemberton, was being frightfully mysterious about the whole business, which was not at all like him. He was generally such an open sort of man, fond of a chat about nothing in particular." Miss Marple filed this away with the same care she gave to a dropped stitch, to be returned to and corrected in its proper place. It was Dr. Haydock, calling at her cottage 2 days later on some pretext of borrowed seed catalogues, who supplied the detail that turned Miss Marple's quiet unease into something closer to certainty. He had, at Colonel Melchet's request, examined Mr. Pemberton's body before the funeral, and he mentioned, almost as an afterthought, that the man's heart had shown some irregularity, though nothing that could not be put down to age and a life spent climbing ladders in a poorly ventilated shop. "Any other irregularity, Doctor?" Miss Marple asked, pouring the tea with the steadiness of a woman discussing the weather. Haydock gave her a shrewd look over his spectacles. He had known Miss Marple a long time and had learned that her questions were never idle. A little discoloration about the fingertips. "I put it down to some chemical he handled in his trade. Restorers use a good many odd substances, don't they, for cleaning old leather and the like. Did you send a sample for analysis?" There seemed no call for it, given the ladder and the position of the body. Melchet was satisfied it was accident, and I confess I saw no obvious reason to argue with him. He paused, and something in Miss Marple's silence appeared to prick at his conscience, for he added, more slowly, "You think there was reason, Miss Marple?" "I think," she said, setting down the teapot with great precision, "that a man does not generally stain his fingers green while dusting the top shelf for county histories. I think a man who falls from a ladder does not remove his spectacles first and lay them down so tidily. And I think, Dr. Haydock, that it is a very great pity indeed that no sample was sent for analysis, because by now the poor man is in the ground and the opportunity has gone with him. Haydock, to his credit, did not laugh at her, though she saw the impulse cross his face before he suppressed it. He had been wrong to dismiss her before, on more than one memorable occasion, and the memory of those occasions kept his tongue in check now. "You believe he was murdered?" "I believe," said Miss Marple, "that it would be foolish to believe anything at all, on so little evidence. But I should very much like to know what Mr. Pemberton was doing with a first edition so rare that an American gentleman was willing to stay a month at the Blue Boar in the hope of buying it, and so secret that he would not even tell dear Lady Bantry its name. People do not generally keep secrets about harmless things, Doctor. It is only the shameful or the valuable that get locked away, and very often, in my experience, it is both at once." She thought, that evening, of the green-bound book she had seen lying open on the shop floor, its pages fanned as though dropped rather than fallen, and wondered whether it might not be the very volume in question. It seemed to her, turning the matter over as she might turn over a piece of knitting to check the pattern on the reverse side, that the shop itself held the answer, if only someone troubled to look properly among its shelves rather than accepting, as Constable Palk had accepted, the first convenient explanation that presented itself. The trouble, of course, was that the shop was shut up and locked, its keys presumably in the hands of whatever solicitor now managed Mr. Pemberton's estate, and Miss Marple, however determined, was not in the habit of breaking into premises, however great her curiosity. She would have to find another way in. She thought of Mr. Aldous Finch, the quiet, careful man who did the shop's binding and restoration work in the room behind, and who had, she recalled, attended the funeral standing very close to the grave, his face composed into an expression of grief so correct it had struck her, even at the time, as somehow rehearsed. Miss Marple sat a while longer after Dr. Haydock had taken his leave, turning her teacup slowly in its saucer without drinking from it, a habit Lady Bantry had once remarked upon as her friend's surest outward sign of serious thought. She considered how very small the world of a village bookshop truly was, and how very large a sum of money might loom within it. £50 meant little enough to a man like Mr. Vane, who spoke of collectors in Boston as though a small fortune were no more than the ordinary cost of doing business, but to a man like Mr. Pemberton, whose shop survived chiefly on Lady Bantry's patronage and the occasional sale of a county history to a curious tourist, such a sum might represent the difference between a comfortable retirement and a very anxious old age. It seemed to her entirely possible that an old man, ordinarily honest, might be tempted just once toward some small deception if the reward were great enough and the risk seemed, at the outset, sufficiently remote. But she found, turning the thought over, that it did not sit comfortably beside everything Lady Bantry and the village at large had told her of Josiah Pemberton's character. A dishonest man does not, as a rule, refuse to sell a rare item to an eager buyer without first squeezing every possible advantage from the transaction, and Pemberton, by every account, had been curiously reluctant to part with the volume at all, delaying and equivocating in a manner that suggested doubt rather than greed. It was this reluctance, more than anything else, that persuaded Miss Marple her first instinct had been the correct one, that whatever deception lay at the heart of the matter, it was not Pemberton's own. Chapter 3. Green Dust. Inspector Slack did not care for amateurs, and he cared least of all for elderly ladies who knitted in his presence while suggesting, in the mildest possible tones, that he might have been hasty in his conclusions. He had been summoned to St. Mary Mead Station on a matter entirely unrelated to Mr. Pemberton, whose death had already been filed away as accidental, and he received Miss Marple's visit with the weary patience of a man who has learned that refusing to listen to her costs more time in the end than listening does. "Now, Miss Marple, I appreciate you mean well," he said, in the voice of a man who did not, in fact, believe this to be true. But Dr. Haydock examined the body and found nothing to contradict an accident. The ladder was old. The rung had a crack in it, if you want to know, which the shop's own restorer pointed out to Constable Palk that very afternoon. Did Mr. Finch point it out before or after the constable had already formed his opinion? Slack's jaw tightened. "I couldn't say that it signifies, Miss Marple. Perhaps not. though I have always found it interesting when a piece of evidence arrives precisely when it is wanted, rather than being found by the person conducting the search. It is rather like a guest who arrives just as the last chair is set out at table. One does wonder how they timed it so well. She had brought with her, wrapped in a clean handkerchief, a small glass jar she had purchased from Boots the chemist, and she set it now upon the inspector's desk, with the air of a woman producing a particularly fine piece of embroidery for inspection. What in the world is that meant to be? Verdigris, Inspector, or something very near it. My gardener uses a copper preparation on the roses each June, and his hands take on precisely this shade for a day or two afterward, no matter how he scrubs them. Dr. Haydock tells me Mr. Pemberton's fingers showed the same discoloration when he examined the body. I wondered whether you might ask him to compare the two, and perhaps to send what remains of the sample for a proper chemical analysis before it becomes impossible to do so. Inspector Slack regarded the jar with the particular suspicion he reserved for anything that threatened to complicate a case he had already closed in his own mind. Roses don't grow in a bookshop, Miss Marple. No, Inspector, but arsenic compounds have been used for a very great many purposes besides gardening. I recall reading, some years ago, that the dye once used to colour green cloth bindings, the sort found on the covers of certain older books, contained a preparation of copper arsenite, the very substance my gardener uses, and that bookbinders and restorers who handled such cloth in quantity sometimes suffered from a slow poisoning of the skin, absorbed through the fingers over weeks and months. It struck me as curious when I recalled that Mr. Pemberton's own restorer works daily with old bindings of every colour, including green. There was a silence in the small office, broken only by the tick of the wall clock and the distant sound of a cart passing in the street outside. Slack was not, whatever his manner suggested, a stupid man, and something in Miss Marple's careful, unhurried recitation of fact had begun, despite himself, to trouble him. You're suggesting Finch poisoned him with bookcloth. I am suggesting nothing at all, Inspector, beyond the fact that a green stain on a dead man's fingers deserves rather more curiosity than it has so far received, and that a chemical analysis, performed now, while it is still possible, would settle the question one way or the other far more reliably than either your opinion or mine. If I am wrong, you will have lost nothing but a little time. If I am right, you will have caught a murderer before he has quite finished covering his tracks, which strikes me as a very reasonable exchange. It was this argument, practical rather than fanciful, that finally moved Slack to action. He agreed, with visible reluctance and several remarks about not wanting his superiors to think him a man who chased old ladies' fancies, to request an exhumation order and a proper analysis of what tissue remained. It would take some days, he warned her, and might well come to nothing. Miss Marple thanked him and left the station well satisfied, for she had not expected instant conviction, only the setting of a wheel in motion that could not now easily be stopped. She walked home slowly through the village, past the bookshop with its blinds still drawn and a small hand-lettered notice pinned to the door announcing that it was closed until further notice, and she paused there a moment, looking at the dark glass as though she might, by looking hard enough, see through both the window and the intervening days to the exact moment of Mr. Pemberton's death. A figure moved behind the glass. Miss Marple, who did not startle easily, felt nonetheless a small cold touch at the back of her neck, and stepped nearer the window in time to see Mr. Aldous Finch cross the darkened shop with a lamp in his hand, moving among the shelves with the sure, unhesitating step of a man who knew exactly what he was looking for and exactly where, among all those hundreds of silent books, it was to be found. She lingered a moment longer at the glass, wondering whether to knock, and decided against it. A confrontation attempted too early, on evidence still largely composed of supposition and the memory of a green stain no larger than a thumbnail, would accomplish nothing beyond warning a guilty man, if guilty he was, that he had been noticed. Miss Marple had learned, over a great many years of quiet observation, that patience served an investigator a good deal better than haste, and that a man who believes himself unsuspected will very often, given time enough, supply the evidence of his own guilt more thoroughly than any direct accusation could ever hope to draw from him. She walked on toward home, past the war memorial and the small green where a handful of boys were playing at cricket, with a bat considerably too large for the smallest of them, and found herself thinking, not for the first time, how strange it was that a village so given over to gossip about trivial things, a torn hem, a burnt joint of beef, a curate's unfortunate choice of hymn, should prove so consistently blind to the one or two matters, in any given season, that truly mattered. It was not, she thought, that St. Mary Mead lacked observation. It was only that observation, undirected, scattered itself across 100 small and harmless targets, and required someone patient enough to gather up the scattered threads and weave them, at last, into a pattern worth examining. Chapter 4. The Vicar's Sister. Miss Prudence Hartley had lived at the vicarage with her brother for 11 years, keeping his accounts, arranging his flowers, and enduring, with the particular patience of unmarried sisters everywhere, his habit of giving away to the deserving poor sums of money that might more usefully have gone toward mending the vicarage roof. She was a thin, anxious woman with quick eyes and a way of touching her collar when she spoke, as though checking that it remained properly fastened, and Miss Marple had known her, in the mild, distant way of village acquaintance, for the better part of 2 decades. It was Mrs. Price Ridley who first brought the matter of Miss Hartley's debt to general attention, in the manner of a woman laying a card upon the table with great satisfaction at her own cleverness in holding it so long. The sewing circle met that Wednesday in the vicarage drawing-room, ostensibly to make garments for the church bazaar, and Mrs. Price Ridley's needle moved considerably less than her tongue. "I have it on the very best authority," she said, lowering her voice to the particular pitch that meant she wished to be heard by everyone in the room, that poor Miss Hartley owed Mr. Pemberton a quite shocking sum. Something to do with a book she borrowed against, if you can credit such a thing, as though it were a pawnbroker's rather than a respectable shop. "Borrowed against a book," said Mrs. Bantry, whose knitting had paused entirely, a sure sign of her interest. "Whatever does that mean?" "It means, my dear, that she gave Mr. Pemberton some family volume as security against money he lent her, which is not at all the sort of transaction one expects to conduct with a bookseller, and which suggests to my mind that matters at the vicarage are rather more strained than the vicar would have us believe." Miss Marple said nothing, but her eyes, which appeared to be entirely occupied with the grey wool in her lap, moved once, briefly, to Miss Hartley's empty chair, for the vicar's sister had that week excused herself from the circle on the plea of a headache, a plea Miss Marple privately suspected owed less to any ailment of the head than to a reluctance to sit through precisely this conversation. She called upon Miss Hartley the following afternoon, ostensibly to return a pattern for a christening gown, and found her in the vicarage garden, cutting the last of the autumn asters with hands that trembled very slightly as she worked. "You've heard, of course," Miss Hartley said, without preamble, before Miss Marple had done more than admire the flowers. "The whole village has heard, I imagine. There is no use my pretending otherwise to you, Miss Marple. You always see through pretending." "I make no claim to seeing through anything, my dear, but I confess I did wonder what a woman in your position could possibly need to borrow money for, when you live so quietly and so well within your means in every other respect." Miss Hartley's hands stilled on the flowers. When she spoke again, her voice had dropped to something barely above a whisper, though there was no one else in the garden to overhear them. "It was for Robert. My brother does not know, and he must not know, Miss Marple. Not ever. Our nephew, my sister's boy, got himself into difficulties in London. Gambling debts, the sort of thing that ends a young man's career at the bank if it becomes known. I could not go to Cuthbert. He would have been so disappointed, and Robert has always been rather delicate about disappointment where family is concerned. Mr. Pemberton was kind enough to lend me the sum against my mother's Bible, which has a rather fine old binding and some family annotations that he said gave it value to a collector. And have you repaid the debt? Most of it. I had perhaps £30 still owing when he died, and now I do not know what will happen to the Bible, or to the debt, or to anything at all. I have been half sick with worry that his solicitor will find the ledger and it will all come out, and Robert will finally know, after everything." Miss Marple regarded her with the particular gentleness she reserved for those whose sins, if sins they could even be called, sprang from love rather than greed. "Did Mr. Pemberton treat you fairly in the matter?" "Entirely fairly. He was kindness itself, if I am honest. though I believe now that he undervalued the Bible rather badly, for I have since learned that old family Bibles with clerical annotations can fetch a surprising sum from the right buyer. Mr. Finch told me so himself when I asked him privately whether it might be redeemed. He said Mr. Pemberton had, in his opinion, been too soft-hearted a businessman for his own good, and that a shop cannot survive on kindness alone. It was a small remark, offered without particular weight, but Miss Marple turned it over that evening with the same care she gave to every loose thread that presented itself, and found that it sat oddly beside another fact she had lately acquired, that Pemberton's rare books, by every outward appearance a struggling concern kept afloat chiefly by Lady Bantry's patronage and the goodwill of the village, had nonetheless found the means, that same spring, to employ Mr. Aldous Finch on what Lady Bantry described as a very generous salary indeed, for a man who did nothing more, so far as anyone could tell, than mend the spines of old books in a back room. A soft-hearted businessman does not, as a rule, pay generously for such quiet, unremarked work, unless the work in question is worth rather more to him than the mending of spines. Chapter 5. A Parcel Under His Coat. Teddy Bantry was Lady Bantry's nephew on the Colonel's side, a pleasant, rather feckless young man of 26, who had come down from Oxford some years before, with a degree he rarely mentioned, and a talent for cricket he mentioned rather more, and who had lately been staying at Gossington Hall, in circumstances his aunt described, whenever anyone was unwise enough to ask, as finding his feet. What Teddy was actually finding, in the considered opinion of most of St. Mary Mead, was an excuse to avoid his father's insistence that he take up a position in the family shipping firm. It was Mrs. Price Ridley, once again, who supplied the detail that set the village talking, having seen from her upstairs window, on 3 separate evenings that week, young Mr. Bantry, leaving the rear of Pemberton's shop by the alley door with a brown paper parcel under his coat, moving, with the quick furtive walk of a boy who does not wish to be observed, and is, for that very reason, observed with tremendous thoroughness. After dark, mind you, Mrs. Price Ridley told the sewing circle, with the particular relish of a woman who has saved her best information for maximum effect. And the shop meant to be closed up entirely since poor Mr. Pemberton's death, with nobody but Mr. Finch permitted inside to see to the stock. What business has young Bantry there, I should like to know, sneaking about in the dark with parcels? Lady Bantry, predictably, was mortified, and came to Miss Marple that same evening in a state of considerable agitation. "Jane, you don't think Teddy could have had anything to do with poor Mr. Pemberton's death? It's absurd. Of course it's absurd, but people are saying such things, and Colonel Bantry will be beside himself if it reaches his ears. What does Teddy himself say when you ask him? That's the trouble. I haven't liked to ask him directly. He's been so odd lately, Jane, moody and short-tempered in a way that isn't like him at all, and I confess I've been rather afraid of what he might say if I pressed him." Miss Marple, who had long held the view that fear of an answer is very often worse than the answer itself, suggested gently that Lady Bantry allow her to speak to the young man instead, as an old woman with no particular authority over him might sometimes learn more than an anxious aunt ever could. She found Teddy in the billiard room at Gossington Hall the following morning, practicing shots he was not, by his own cheerful admission, playing very well. He was a good-natured young man, easy to talk to, and Miss Marple's approach was correspondingly direct, for she had found over many years that young men respond better to plain speaking than to the delicate circling more suited to their elders. "Your aunt is worried about the parcels, Teddy." He had the grace to flush, though he did not, she noted, look either frightened or guilty, in the particular way a murderer surprised in his secret might look. His discomfort had the quality of embarrassment rather than fear, and Miss Marple, who had seen both emotions on a great many faces over the years, knew the difference at once. "Oh, Lord, I suppose the whole village has been watching me trot in and out like a burglar. It's nothing sinister, Miss Marple, I promise you that, though I'd rather my aunt didn't know the particulars, if it's all the same to you. I make no promises about your aunt, Teddy, though I am generally discreet where discretion is warranted. What is in the parcels?" He set down his cue with something like relief, as though glad, after days of furtive evenings, to finally unburden himself to someone. "Books, Miss Marple. My own books. I've been rather a fool, if you want the truth of it. I ran up debts at Oxford I never properly told my father about, and I've been selling off bits of my collection to Finch, quietly, through the back door, because I couldn't bear for it to be known at the front counter that Lady Bantry needed to pawn his own library to stay afloat. Finch has been decent about it, gives me a fair price and no questions asked, and asked me to come after hours so old Pemberton wouldn't see and think less of me for it. Pemberton could be rather severe about young men and money, you know, for all his general kindness. And since Mr. Pemberton's death, why continue after dark when there is no longer anyone to disapprove? Teddy shrugged, a little uncomfortably. Habit, I suppose. And Finch asked me to keep it quiet a while longer, said it wasn't the moment for the shop's affairs to be gossiped over, what with the police still sniffing about. I didn't think much of it at the time. Ought I to have? Miss Marple did not answer him directly, though she noted the detail with the same quiet attention she gave to everything else that came within her reach, that Mr. Finch, in the days immediately following his employer's death, had been more concerned with keeping the shop's backdoor transactions from the notice of the police than with mourning the man who had, by every account, treated him generously. It was, she thought, walking back through the village with her basket on her arm, precisely the sort of small and telling inconsistency that a murderer, however careful, could not always help but leave behind him, like a thread caught on a nail and left trailing from an otherwise well-mended coat. Chapter 6. Behind the Counter. The solicitor handling Mr. Pemberton's estate, a dry, careful man named Mr. Annesley from Much Benham, proved surprisingly amenable to Miss Marple's request that she be permitted to view the shop, provided she was accompanied and touched nothing of value. He had, he confided, a horror of village gossip attaching itself to the estate before probate was settled, and he judged, correctly, that Miss Marple's presence was rather more likely to quiet the village's imagination than to inflame it. Mr. Aldous Finch met them at the door, with the keys already in his hand, as though he had been expecting the visit, or perhaps expected visits of this kind as a matter of course. He was a neat, contained man of perhaps 50, with ink-stained fingers and the stooped shoulders of one who has spent a lifetime bent over close work, and his manner toward Miss Marple was courteous without being warm, the manner of a man accustomed to dealing with customers he did not particularly wish to please. "You'll forgive the dust, Miss Marple. I've kept the workshop tidy, but the front of the shop I've left much as it was. Didn't seem my place to disturb it, with the police still taking an interest, whatever they say publicly about accidents." "That is very proper of you, Mr. Finch. You have worked here long? 6 years come summer, longer than most in the trade stay in one place. But Mr. Pemberton treated me fairly, and a man values that more than he values variety, once he's my age." He said this with no particular emotion, in the flat tone of a man reciting a fact rather than mourning a loss, and Miss Marple, whose ear for the difference between grief and its performance had been sharpened by long practice at funerals and sickbeds alike, noted the flatness and set it beside everything else she had gathered. She asked to see the workshop, and Finch led her through without hesitation, past shelves of tools she did not recognize and jars of paste and dye whose purposes she could only guess at, until they reached a long bench beneath the single high window, where a length of dark green cloth lay stretched and pinned, half sewn into what would become, she supposed, the new binding for some old and damaged volume. "That is a very particular shade of green, Mr. Finch." "A period cloth, Miss Marple. Difficult to match nowadays, the old dyes having largely gone out of manufacture. I keep a small stock for restoration work on Victorian volumes, where the original binding's beyond saving, but the buyer wants the look preserved as near as possible to the original." "Is it dangerous to work with?" Something in Finch's manner altered, so slightly that a less attentive observer might have missed it entirely. A stillness that entered his hands where before they had moved easily among his tools. "No more than any dye, if a man's careful and washes properly afterward." "Why do you ask, Miss Marple?" "Curiosity, Mr. Finch, nothing more. I am an old woman with a great many idle hours, and I confess I find myself endlessly interested in the small chemistries of ordinary trades. My own gardener could tell you a great deal about copper preparations and their effect upon the skin, and it struck me, standing here, that a bookbinder's dyes might hold similar secrets." She watched him carefully as she spoke, and saw the stillness in his hands deepen for the space of perhaps 2 seconds before he resumed his work with a smoothness that was, she thought, very slightly too smooth, the recovery of a man who has trained himself to show nothing rather than a man who has nothing to show. "I couldn't say, Miss Marple. I'm no chemist, only a craftsman. I take the materials as they come to me and trust the suppliers to have made them safe." They spoke a little longer of ordinary things, the weather, the fate of the shop's stock, whether Mr. Annesley had yet found a buyer willing to keep it running as a bookshop rather than clearing it for some more profitable trade. And Miss Marple, taking her leave at the front counter, allowed her eye to fall upon the shop's great leather-bound ledger, still lying open where Pemberton had last left it, its pages showing the small, careful entries of a man who recorded every transaction, however small, with old-fashioned thoroughness. "He kept excellent records, your Mr. Pemberton. He did. A very orderly man in most things." Finch's voice carried, for the first time that afternoon, something that might have been genuine feeling, though whether it was affection or regret, or something considerably colder, Miss Marple could not, on so brief an acquaintance, be entirely certain. She left the shop with the strong impression, difficult to articulate to Mr. Annesley, in terms a solicitor would find satisfactory, that Mr. Aldous Finch was a man keeping a very great many things in very good order indeed, and that not all of them were the sort of things a solicitor's inventory would ever think to include. Outside the shop, Mr. Annesley waited by his motor car with the particular patience of a man who bills by the hour and does not much enjoy watching that hour spent on matters outside the strict business of probate. Miss Marple thanked him for his indulgence and declined his offer of a lift home, preferring, as she told him, to walk while the afternoon remained fine, though her true reason, unspoken, was rather that walking gave her time to think without the distraction of polite conversation. She passed the shop window once more, before turning down toward her own cottage, and paused there, looking in at the darkened front room with its shelves of silent books, its counter still bearing the faint outline in the dust where the great ledger customarily lay. It struck her, standing there, that a bookshop was in some ways a peculiarly apt setting for the sort of deception she now suspected, for a book, by its very nature, asked to be trusted on faith. A buyer could not, after all, have witnessed its printing a century before, could not verify with his own eyes the year stamped upon its title page, and must rely instead upon the honesty of the trade itself, upon booksellers and restorers who understood that their entire livelihood rested upon exactly the kind of trust a forger chooses, quite deliberately, to betray. It seemed to her a peculiarly ungrateful sort of crime, committed against an industry that had, in Mr. Finch's case at least, given him a respectable living and an honourable name for the better part of 30 years. Chapter 7. What the Sewing Circle Knew. The Sewing Circle met again the following Wednesday, and Miss Marple, who rarely missed a meeting and had missed none this autumn in particular, arrived early enough to secure the chair nearest the window, from which vantage she could observe both the room and, at need, the street outside, without appearing to do either with any purpose. It was generally agreed among the ladies of St. Mary Mead that a sewing circle accomplished a great deal more in the way of information than in the way of garments, and this Wednesday proved no exception. Mrs. Bantry, unable to resist the pull of a mystery unfolding on her own doorstep, had brought with her a fresh piece of intelligence gleaned from her cook, whose sister was in service at the Blue Boar. "Mr. Vane has been asking after Mr. Finch," Mrs. Bantry announced, with the air of a woman laying down a trump card, asking whether he might be persuaded to authenticate a book privately, outside the shop's normal business, and offering, so my cook's sister overheard while serving the gentleman's tea, a very considerable sum for the service. Now, why should an American collector need a private authentication when the shop itself has a perfectly good expert on the premises? "Perhaps," said Mrs. Price Ridley, not to be outdone, "he does not trust the shop's authentication now that Mr. Pemberton is no longer there to yutch for it personally. I have always understood that book collecting is a business quite riddled with forgery and sharp practice, rather like the trade in old paintings." Miss Marple's needles, which had been moving with their customary steady rhythm, paused for the briefest of moments before resuming, a hesitation so slight that only a woman watching for it would have noticed it at all, and no one in the room happened to be watching Miss Marple, which was, as it generally was, rather to her advantage. "Forgery," she said mildly, into the small silence that followed Mrs. Price Ridley's remark, "is a very interesting word and a very old crime, though I confess I had not thought of it in connection with books before. One thinks of forged wills, forged signatures, forged banknotes, but rarely forged books. And yet I suppose a rare edition, properly aged and properly bound, might deceive a buyer quite as thoroughly as a forged signature deceives a bank clerk, provided the forger possessed the right materials and the right skill. Well, and who in St. Mary Mead would possess such skill, I should like to know," said Mrs. Bantry, laughing at the very idea. "We are hardly a nest of master forgers, Jane." "No," Miss Marple agreed, her eyes on her knitting, "though I believe it takes rather less of a nest than one might suppose. A single skilled craftsman, working quietly in a back room with old cloth and old paste and a genuine understanding of how such things ought properly to look and feel and smell, might manage a very great deal indeed, particularly if he had a business partner willing to vouch for the piece's provenance to a buyer eager enough to overlook a few inconvenient questions." She said this lightly, in the tone of idle speculation rather than accusation, and the circle moved on, as sewing circles do, to matters of hemlines and the vicar's forthcoming sermon on charitable giving. But Miss Marple had planted, quite deliberately, a small seed in fertile ground, and she trusted, with the patient confidence of a gardener who has learned which soils reward which seeds, that word of her speculation would reach precisely the ears she intended it to reach, carried there by the same swift and untraceable channels that had carried every other piece of village news that autumn. It was 2 days later that Dr. Haydock called upon her again, this time with genuine news rather than borrowed pretext. "The analysis came back, Miss Marple. You were right, or near enough to it. There was a measurable quantity of arsenic present in the tissue samples, considerably more than could be explained by ordinary environmental exposure. Melchett is taking it seriously now, I can tell you. Slack's gone quite pale about it, having closed the case publicly as an accident only a fortnight ago. I am glad they are taking it seriously, Doctor, though I confess I had rather hoped for this outcome than expected it, given how much time had already passed. There's more. Melchett had a man go through Pemberton's private correspondence, kept in a locked drawer at the vicarage solicitor's office rather than the shop itself, oddly enough, and they found a letter, unfinished, dated the very day of his death, in which he appears to accuse someone, unnamed, of having deceived him in a matter of, and I quote his own words, Miss Marple, considerable dishonour to the trade. He seems to have intended to write to a fellow bookseller in London for a second opinion on some item, but the letter breaks off mid-sentence. Miss Marple set down her tea with great care, and for a moment said nothing at all, though her mind moved with a swiftness that would have surprised anyone who judged her only by her placid exterior. Then he had discovered something, Doctor, on the very day he died, and had not yet told anyone what it was, which means, I think, that whoever silenced him did so not to protect a secret already exposed, but to prevent one that was on the very point of coming out. Chapter 8. The Blue Boar. Miss Marple did not, as a rule, frequent public houses, but the Blue Boar's small parlour served an excellent tea to any respectable lady who cared to take it there, and it was in this parlour, on a wet Thursday afternoon, that she arranged, through the good offices of the landlord's wife, to be seated at the table adjoining Mr. Cyrus Vane's when he came down for his own tea. He was, on closer acquaintance, a less formidable figure than his tailoring suggested. A man whose bluff American manner concealed, Miss Marple judged within the first 5 minutes of conversation, a considerable anxiety about money spent and not yet recovered. He was perfectly willing to talk, once she had introduced herself as a friend of the late Mr. Pemberton's, and rather more willing still, once she mentioned with careful vagueness that she had heard something of his interest in a certain rare volume. "You'll think me a fool, ma'am, chasing across an ocean after a book, but there are men back home who'd pay a small fortune for a genuine first edition of the item in question, provenance established, and I stood to make a very tidy profit on the deal myself, brokering it through to a client of mine in Boston. Pemberton showed me a photograph of the piece, back in the spring, claimed he'd come across it in a house clearance out Much Benham Way. A family library nobody'd properly catalogued in 50 years. Said it needed some restoration work before he could let it go, given its condition, and that his man Finch was handling that side of things. And did you ever see the actual volume, Mr. Vane, rather than the photograph? Once. Pemberton let me handle it, under his eye, mind you, very careful about it, wouldn't let it out of the shop. Looked the part, I'll say that. Old cloth, foxed pages, the right sort of wear on the spine. But something about it troubled me, and I've handled enough rare items in my time to trust that feeling when it comes. He leaned forward, lowering his voice, though there was no one else in the small parlour to overhear him. The smell was wrong, ma'am. An old book's got a particular smell, dry, a little sweet, like old leaves. This one had something sharper under it, like fresh paste not quite worked in yet. I said nothing at the time, didn't want to insult the man, but I went back to my hotel and I wrote to a colleague in London, an expert in bindings, asking him to come down and give me his honest opinion before I committed a single dollar. Did your colleague come? He was engaged to arrive the very week Pemberton died. I had to send a wire putting him off, given the circumstances, and I confess I haven't had the heart to reschedule since, not knowing what's become of the item, or who has charge of it now. I approached Finch about it, quietly, hoping he might arrange a private viewing before the estate sale, whenever that comes, but he's been evasive, keeps saying the matter's complicated by the police inquiry. Miss Marple thanked him for his candour and left the Blue Boar with her umbrella and a great deal to consider, for Mr. Vane's account confirmed, in its essentials, what she had already begun to suspect, that the rare volume Pemberton had shown him was not the genuine article he believed it to be, but a forgery skilled enough to deceive an experienced eye at first handling, and skilled enough, she thought, to require exactly the sort of craftsman St. Mary Mead happened to possess in Mr. Aldous Finch. She walked home slowly in the drizzle, turning the pieces over as she went. Pemberton had shown Vane the book in spring, believing it genuine, or at least genuine enough to sell in good conscience, a house clearance find of real, if modest, value. Somewhere between the spring and the autumn, something had changed. Perhaps Vane's unease had reached Pemberton's own ears, second-hand, and set him examining the piece more closely himself. Perhaps he had simply, being an honest man by every account she had gathered, grown troubled by his own doubts and begun asking Finch questions Finch had not wished to answer. Either way, the unfinished letter Dr. Haydock had described, accusing someone unnamed of dishonour to the trade, took on, in light of Vane's account, a shape considerably clearer than before. It seemed to Miss Marple, arriving at last at her own gate with her shoes rather damper than she would have liked, that the case had at its centre not a theft, nor a debt, nor a young man's foolish pride, but something older and simpler than any of these, a craftsman who had used his genuine skill to build a false thing, and a kind, honest employer who had, on the very day of his death, come uncomfortably close to discovering it. She thought, too, of Mr. Vane himself, whom she had rather liked despite his profession, which she understood to be one that rewarded a certain ruthlessness she did not generally admire. He had, after all, been prepared to pay a very great sum of money for an object he could not, by his own admission, be entirely certain was genuine, trusting to reputation and photograph and Pemberton's own good name rather than to the sterner proofs a more cautious buyer might have insisted upon first. It was not dishonesty in Vane that troubled her, but a kind of willing blindness common, she suspected, to a great many transactions where a large enough profit stood to be made, a blindness that asked few hard questions so long as the answers it might receive threatened to be inconvenient. Pemberton, to his credit, had not shared that blindness once his own doubts were roused. Whatever his failings as a businessman, and Mr. Finch himself had called him too soft-hearted for the trade, he had proved, in the end, a man unwilling to profit from a lie once he suspected it for what it was, and it was this unwillingness, Miss Marple reflected with some sorrow, that had very probably cost him his life. The rain had not let up by the time she reached her own gate, and she stood a moment beneath the dripping laurel, considering how best to proceed. A suspicion, however strong, was not proof, and proof, in a matter of this delicacy, would require rather more than an American gentleman's account of a smell he had noticed and half doubted at the time. She would need the ledger examined properly and the shop's materials tested by someone with the chemical knowledge to make the comparison stick. And for that she would need Inspector Slack's cooperation rather more thoroughly than she had yet secured it. Chapter 9. The Ledger Page. It was Mr. Annesley, the solicitor, who unwittingly supplied the next piece of the pattern, calling upon Miss Marple to ask, in his dry, precise way, whether she might assist him in making sense of certain irregularities he had discovered while completing his inventory of the shop's stock and accounts. An inventory that had, by every appearance, been kept with scrupulous care right up until the final months of Mr. Pemberton's life. The odd thing, Miss Marple, is a page torn from the ledger. Not lost, not misplaced, torn, quite deliberately, close against the binding, so that only the narrowest stub remains to show a page ever existed there at all. The entries on either side are dated, so I can tell you the missing page must have covered a period of perhaps 10 days in late September, but of what those entries recorded, I can naturally tell you nothing. Late September, Miss Marple repeated thoughtfully. That would be shortly before Mr. Pemberton's death, would it not? A little under a month before, yes. I confess I find it troubling, though I cannot say precisely why a torn page should trouble a solicitor more than any other small untidiness in an estate. Perhaps it is simply that Pemberton was, in every other particular, such an orderly man. A page torn from his ledger is rather like finding a single crooked picture in an otherwise perfectly hung gallery. It offends the eye, quite apart from any question of what it might mean. Miss Marple asked, with the particular gentleness she employed when she wished a request to seem smaller than it was, whether she might be permitted to examine the stub itself, and Mr. Annesley, who had by now developed a considerable respect for her judgment, arranged for her to visit the shop once more that same afternoon. The stub, when she examined it closely by the light of the workshop's high window, told her little on its own, a ragged margin of paper perhaps half an inch wide, with the faintest indentation of pen strokes visible near the torn edge where the writer's hand had pressed hardest, but held at an angle to the light, in the manner Miss Marple had once seen a bank clerk use to detect an altered figure on a cheque. The indentations resolved themselves, with patience, into fragments of words. A capital F, she was nearly certain, the figure 4, or perhaps a poorly formed 9, and, most tellingly of all, what appeared to be the beginning of the word Orthen, broken off where the page had been torn away. She stood a long moment with the ledger in her hands, and it seemed to her that she could almost see the scene as it must have unfolded. Pemberton, sitting at this very counter some 10 days before his death, recording in his own careful hand some transaction concerning authentication, a transaction involving, if her reading of the fragment was correct, someone whose name began with F, and a sum of money large enough that the figures had been pressed hard into the page by a man perhaps troubled, even then, by what he was writing down. "Mr. Finch," she said aloud to the empty workshop, "you told Mr. Pemberton, on some date in late September, in that you had authenticated something you had not, or that you required a very great deal of money to authenticate something you knew perfectly well to be false." And Mr. Pemberton wrote it down, as was his habit in all things, before he had properly understood what he was writing, or perhaps precisely because he had begun, even then, to suspect. She did not touch the ledger further, mindful of Mr. Annesley's instructions, but she noted the page number carefully, and the exact wording of the entries immediately before and after the torn stub, one recording the sale of a set of county histories to a Mrs. Farrow, of Much Benham, for the sum of 11 shillings, the other recording, 3 days after the missing entries, a payment of £50 to A. Finch, marked simply restoration work, as agreed. £50 was, by any measure Miss Marple could bring to bear from her own long experience of village economies, a very considerable sum indeed for the restoration of a single volume, however rare, and it occurred to her, walking home once more through the thin autumn sunshine, that £50 paid openly in the ledger for restoration work might sit very comfortably beside some larger sum paid privately. Off the books entirely, for work of quite a different character, work that a careful man would naturally wish to keep no record of at all, and that an honest man, discovering it, might feel compelled to record in a page he later thought better of, and tore away, meaning perhaps to confront its subject before committing his suspicions permanently to paper. The page itself, Miss Marple suspected, was very probably burned, along with whatever draft of the unfinished letter Dr. Haydock had described, in the small grate she had noticed behind the workshop bench, its ashes scattered by now, beyond any hope of recovery. But its absence, she reflected, told her nearly as much as its presence would have done, for an innocent man does not, as a rule, trouble himself to burn evidence of his own innocence. She thought, walking home, of a small principle she had formed many years before, and found repeatedly confirmed since, that the guilty rarely destroy evidence with the thoroughness they imagine. A man in the grip of panic, or even of cold calculation, attends to the large and obvious dangers, the letter that names him outright, the object that could be traced directly to his hand, but overlooks, more often than not, the small residues that panic cannot think to anticipate, the stub of a torn page, the indentation of a pen pressed too hard, the faint discoloration lingering beneath a fingernail long after the hands themselves have been scrubbed clean. It was these small residues, gathered patiently over weeks rather than seized upon in a single dramatic discovery, that generally proved the undoing of even the most careful criminal. And Miss Marple, who had never in her life considered herself anything but an ordinary elderly woman with rather more time on her hands than most, found a certain quiet satisfaction in the thought that patience, applied steadily enough, could accomplish what cleverness alone very often could not. She resolved, before retiring that evening, to write a short note to Inspector Slack, requesting that he examine the workshop grate for ash, and a second, rather more delicately worded, to Dr. Haydock, asking whether copper arsenite compounds of the kind used in old bookcloth left any lingering trace beneath the fingernails that might still, even now, be detected upon careful re-examination of whatever samples remained from the original post-mortem. Chapter 10. Loose Threads. Inspector Slack, chastened by the arsenic analysis, and considerably more willing than before to entertain Miss Marple's opinions, called upon her that evening, with Colonel Melchett's blessing, to compare what each of them had gathered. He brought with him the news that Scotland Yard's own document examiner, consulted at Melchett's insistence, had confirmed what Mr. Vane's nose had already suspected. The green-bound volume recovered from the shop's window display bore a binding of modern manufacture, disguised with considerable skill to appear decades old, the paste beneath its spine not yet fully cured, the foxing on its pages produced, in the examiner's professional opinion, by careful application of weak tea rather than by the honest passage of time. A forgery, then, near enough proven, Slack said, with the particular satisfaction of a policeman finally permitted to say something with confidence. Question is whether Finch worked alone or had help, and whether the forgery's enough on its own to explain a murder, or whether there's something more to it. I think, said Miss Marple, pouring the tea with her usual unhurried precision, that you must ask yourself what a man in Mr. Finch's position stood to lose, Inspector, rather than only what he stood to gain. A forger discovered loses more than his profit on a single sale. He loses his reputation in a trade that runs, as I understand it, very largely on trust and personal recommendation between one bookseller and another. Mr. Finch had, by his own account, worked in the trade for a good many years before coming to St. Mary Mead. A man does not build such a reputation quickly, nor does he relish seeing it destroyed in a single afternoon by an employer who has, up to that point, treated him with every kindness. You think Pemberton confronted him directly? I think it very likely, given the torn ledger page and the unfinished letter, that Mr. Pemberton had begun to suspect the volume was not what it claimed to be, quite possibly prompted by Mr. Vane's own doubts reaching him at second hand through village gossip. Gossip travels remarkably fast in St. Mary Mead. Inspector, faster, I think, than either of us properly appreciates. I believe Mr. Pemberton went to Mr. Finch, perhaps on the very morning of his death, to ask him plainly whether the volume was genuine, giving him, in his kindness, the chance to explain himself before any formal accusation was made. And I believe Mr. Finch, understanding precisely what such an accusation would cost him, chose a quieter and more permanent method of ensuring it was never made at all. Slack turned this over for a long moment, his tea cooling untouched in his hand. The green stain. You said arsenic's used in the old cloth dyes. Skeels green and its later variants, Inspector, contained a compound of copper and arsenic, used a great deal in the last century for cloth and wallpaper and paint alike, until its dangers became more widely understood. A restorer working regularly with old green cloth would have such material readily to hand and would understand, better than almost anyone else in the village, exactly how dangerous a quantity, applied to the skin in sufficient concentration, might prove to a man of Mr. Pemberton's age and constitution. I imagine it was applied to the ladder rail Mr. Pemberton habitually gripped, and perhaps to the arm of his own spectacles, which he was in the habit, Lady Bantry tells me, of pushing up his nose with his fingertip a great many times each day. A slow poisoning, growing worse over hours rather than minutes, would allow Mr. Finch ample time to establish himself elsewhere before Mr. Pemberton, dizzy and weakened, climbed his ladder for the last time and fell, whether from the poison's effect upon his balance or simply from his own failing strength. We may never know for certain. The fall itself may have been genuine. It was, I think, merely convenient rather than staged, though the tidy position of the spectacles suggests Mr. Finch returned afterward to arrange the scene a little and perhaps to remove any trace of the substance from the ladder rail before the body was discovered. That's a great deal of supposition, Miss Marple, if you'll forgive my saying so. It is, Inspector, and I would not ask you to arrest a man on supposition alone, but supposition, tested carefully against the facts as we gather them, has a way of either collapsing or hardening into something considerably more solid, and I believe, if you examine the ladder rail itself, not yet cleaned, I think, given the shop's continued closure, you may find traces of the same substance found in Mr. Pemberton's own tissue. I believe, too, that if you press Mr. Finch on the matter of the £50 recorded openly in the ledger and ask him plainly what larger sum was recorded on the page now missing, you may see in his face something that no amount of professional composure can entirely conceal. A guilty man can control his voice a great deal more easily than he can control the small movements of his hands. Slack left St. Mary Mead's small sitting room that evening, rather later than he had intended, and considerably more thoughtful than he had arrived, carrying with him not an arrest warrant, for Miss Marple had been careful to give him nothing so definite as that, but a plan, modest and precise, for the following morning's interview with Mr. Aldous Finch, an interview Miss Marple had, with her usual tact, suggested might benefit from being conducted at the shop itself, among the very shelves and tools where, she felt certain, the truth would prove considerably harder to keep hidden than it had in the neutral ground of a police station office. Chapter 11. The Trap Among the Shelves. The following morning arrived cold and bright, the sort of clear October day that makes even the dustiest corners of a village shop look, for an hour or two, almost cheerful. Miss Marple had asked, and Colonel Melchett, now thoroughly persuaded of the case's seriousness, had somewhat reluctantly granted that she be permitted to attend the interview, on the understanding that she would say nothing unless directly invited to, an understanding she accepted with the outward meekness of a woman who had, in fact, no intention whatsoever of remaining silent should the moment call for otherwise. Mr. Finch received them at the shop door with his usual composure, though Miss Marple, watching closely, noted that his hand lingered a moment too long on the doorknob before he stepped back to admit them, and that his eyes moved once, swiftly, toward the workshop at the rear, as a man's eyes move toward a thing he wishes were already destroyed, and is not. Inspector Slack began with the ledger, laying the volume open upon the counter to the torn stub, and asking, in his flattest official voice, what Mr. Finch could tell him about the missing page. "I've no idea what you mean, Inspector. Mr. Pemberton kept his own ledger. I never had cause to write in it myself. But you had cause to be recorded in it. £50, 3 days after whatever was written on this missing page and then torn out. Restoration work, as agreed." "What was agreed, Mr. Finch, and with whom?" Finch's composure did not break, not visibly, but Miss Marple, watching his hands rather than his face, saw them close slowly at his sides, the fingers curling into the palms with the particular stillness of a man exerting considerable effort to keep them from trembling. "A restoration commission, nothing more. I can't be expected to account for every page in another man's private ledger, Inspector, torn or otherwise. Mr. Vane tells us the volume he was shown in spring had a smell about it that troubled him. Fresh paste, he said, under the old leather smell. Our own examiner in London confirms the binding's modern work, disguised, and disguised very skillfully indeed, by someone who understood exactly how an old book ought to look and feel. That's craftsman's work, Mr. Finch. Not a bookseller's, a craftsman's. It was at this point, with Finch still saying nothing, his silence stretching thin and taut across the small shop, that Miss Marple judged the moment had come for the small final push she had prepared, and she stepped forward, her voice as mild and unhurried as it had been throughout the entire inquiry, as though she were remarking upon nothing more consequential than the weather. "I noticed, Mr. Finch, when I visited your workshop, that the green cloth on your bench was cut rather generously for the small repair you claimed to be undertaking. I wondered at the time whether you were perhaps preparing a fresh piece for a fresh binding, rather than simply mending an old one. I wonder now whether that cloth, or cloth very much like it, might still be found among your materials, and whether, tested by the same chemists who examined poor Mr. Pemberton's tissue, it might not prove to contain rather more copper arsenite than any modern manufacturer would think it wise to use." The stillness that followed her words lasted only a moment, but it was, Miss Marple thought afterward, describing the scene to Lady Bantry over tea, a moment in which she watched something give way behind Aldous Finch's carefully composed face, not dramatically, not with any cry or sudden movement, but quietly, the way a dam gives way at last after days of patient pressure, a single crack widening until the whole structure can no longer hold. "He would have ruined me," Finch said, and his voice, when it finally came, held none of the flat professional courtesy it had carried throughout the interview, only a tired, bitter honesty that seemed, in its way, more unsettling than any outburst could have been. 30 years in this trade, Inspector. 30 years of honest work, and one bad year, one debt I couldn't see my way clear of. And I thought, why not? Why shouldn't a man with my skill turn it to some profit for once, instead of mending other men's treasures for a wage that barely covers his rent? Vane would never have known the difference. No one would have known, if Pemberton hadn't started asking his fool questions, poking at things that were none of his business, threatening to write to London and finish me in front of every dealer who'd ever trusted my name on a piece of restoration work. I only meant to frighten him off the idea. I never meant for it to go so far as it did. You meant precisely that, Mr. Finch, Miss Marple said, gently but without softening the truth of it. Or you would have stopped the moment you saw how ill he had become. A man who merely wishes to frighten another does not apply a substance he knows, from long professional experience, to be capable of killing, to the very rail and the very spectacles that man handles 100 times a day. Finch did not answer her. He sat down instead, quite suddenly, upon the workshop stool, his hands hanging loose between his knees, and it was in this posture, defeated and strangely diminished, that Inspector Slack, with a formality that seemed, after the quiet drama of the confession, almost anticlimactic, placed him under arrest for the murder of Josiah Pemberton. Chapter 12. Tea at Gossington Hall. The official account, printed in the Much Benham Gazette some 10 days later, credited the arrest of Aldous Finch entirely to the diligent detective work of Inspector Slack and the chemical expertise of Scotland Yard, and made no mention whatsoever of an elderly lady with a fondness for knitting who had first noticed a green stain on a dead man's fingers and a pair of spectacles laid down too tidily to have fallen. Colonel Melchett, calling briefly at Miss Marple's cottage to thank her privately for her assistance, remarked with some embarrassment that these things were generally handled so in the official record, and Miss Marple assured him, with perfect sincerity, that she preferred it that way entirely. "The police must be seen to solve their own cases, Colonel, or the whole village would lose confidence in Constable Palk. And where should we be then? I have never had the slightest wish for my name to appear in the Gazette. It would only bring a great many curious strangers to my garden gate, wanting to discuss the affair, and I have quite enough demands upon my time as it is, what with the church bazaar approaching, and my roses needing their winter pruning." Lady Bantry, who held no such scruples about credit and had in any case never quite mastered the art of keeping a good story to herself, gathered the sewing circle at Gossington Hall the following Wednesday for what she described, without irony, as a small celebratory tea, at which the entire affair was discussed, dissected and thoroughly enjoyed by every lady present, Miss Marple included, though Miss Marple contributed rather less to the discussion than the others expected of her, given her central role in the matter's resolution. "I still cannot credit it," Mrs. Bantry said, accepting a second scone with the particular appetite of a woman whose nerves, having been thoroughly exercised over the preceding fortnight, now required considerable soothing. "Mr. Finch always seemed such a quiet, respectable sort of man. One would never have suspected him of anything worse than a slightly unsociable manner." "That is generally how it is, my dear," Miss Marple said, her needles moving once more with their familiar patient rhythm. "The respectable, quiet ones are so very often the most dangerous, precisely because no one thinks to look at them closely. We are all of us far too willing to judge a man's character by his manners, when manners can be taught and practiced and worn like a good coat, while character itself lies underneath, quite unaltered by any amount of polish on the surface." Mr. Finch had 30 years of genuine skill and genuine reputation built up behind him, and I believe he told himself, at the start, that a single small deception could not possibly undo 30 years of honest work. It is a very common piece of self-deception, that one. People rarely set out meaning to become murderers. They set out meaning only to solve some small, pressing difficulty, and each small solution leads them, step by step, further from where they began than they ever intended to travel, until they find themselves one morning standing over a man they once respected, doing a thing they could never, at the outset, have imagined themselves capable of doing. Miss Prudence Hartley, present that afternoon, and considerably recovered from her earlier anxiety, now that her small debt had been quietly settled by her nephew Robert, who had at last confessed the whole business to a father, rather more understanding than she had feared, ventured to ask what would become of the shop itself. "Mr. Annesley tells me a buyer has already come forward," Lady Bantry said. "A retired schoolmaster from Much Benham, I believe, who means to keep it as a proper bookshop rather than clearing it out for something more fashionable. I am very glad to hear it. St. Mary Mead would look sadly reduced without a bookshop on the High Street, whatever Colonel Bantry says about Roman roads." Teddy Bantry, who had joined his aunt's tea rather reluctantly and only on the promise of a decent slice of cake, added that he had already arranged to buy back several of his own volumes from the estate, at what he cheerfully admitted was a very fair price indeed, and that he had, moreover, finally written to his father in full about the Oxford debts, a confession that had gone, by his own account, rather better than he had feared. Miss Marple listened to all of this with quiet satisfaction, for she had long held the private conviction that a village mystery, properly resolved, tended to leave behind it not only a punished wrongdoer, but a scattering of smaller honesties shaken loose in its wake, secrets that might otherwise have festered quietly for years, finally spoken aloud, and, in the speaking, made bearable. She thought of Josiah Pemberton, whose kindness had, in the end, cost him his life, and whose shop would now pass to a keeper who might, she hoped, prove worthy of the trust he had always placed so freely, and perhaps too freely, in those around him. The afternoon light slanted low and gold through the windows of Gossington Hall, catching the wool in Miss Marple's lap, and somewhere beyond the garden a blackbird sang the same unhurried evening song it had sung every autumn of her long life in St. Mary Mead, indifferent to murder, indifferent to justice, occupied only with its own small and enduring business. Miss Marple found, as she so often did at the close of these affairs, a certain comfort in that indifference, a reminder that the village would go on, ordinary and unhurried, long after this particular sorrow had faded into nothing more than another story told over tea, one more thread woven quietly into the long, patient fabric of St. Mary Mead's remembered years.